Now, it's Monday morning, just after 11 o'clock. It's time to say a very good morning to our good friend and competent Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter, very good morning.
Morning to you.
I read with interest your historically based piece this weekend about Churchill and about the debt that we got into. Do you want to just give us a quick summation of that so people can hear it?
My point was simply this, that governments which spend more money than they have get into deep trouble. And there are two historical facts which are known to me because I've researched them for my last book, which are generally either unknown or actually rejected by people because they simply refuse to admit that they're the case. The first is that in 1934 this country defaulted on the gigantic debt which we owed to the United States for First World War support, calculated now to be something in the region of $225 billion.
Right.
And we simply stopped paying it, and we stopped paying interest on it, and so basically we became a sort of third world defaulter nation and put ourselves permanently and forever in the pocket of the USA. We then...
How was that manifested, though? Because
it manifested itself increasingly in our diminished power. The problem became particularly, and indeed also very frosty relations between us and the United States. This is a fascinating piece of history, but people are still beguiled by this great shoulder-to-shoulder myth of the alliance between us and the USA. In 1939, the Americans were simply refusing to, under something called the Neutrality Act, which was passed in revenge for our default on our debts, were refusing to give us any weapons at all unless we paid cash on the nail for them. And so in the period between the beginning of the war and the end of 1940, secret fast convoys were constantly speeding across the Atlantic to Canada, carrying all the life savings of the British Empire,
right,
including all the gold we had, right back to the gold moidores and doubloons that we'd looted from Spanish galleons in the 16th century. Everything we had, plus a lot of negotiable securities, was simply sent across, and most of it never came back. It was used to pay for the weapons we desperately needed. And then around about the end of 1940, beginning of 1941, we simply ran out of money. And the Americans put us through a sort of audit, going right the way through our national accounts. We had to open up everything to them. And the Senate Foreign Relations Committee were eventually told by Henry Morgenthau, who was Roosevelt's Secretary for the Treasury, that if they didn't come up with some way of helping us, then we just have to stop fighting. And that's where the famous Lend-Lease began, under which the Americans supplied us with war material and other help to keep us going through the war. But they abruptly ended all that in 1945, and we then had to go back to them. Maynard Keynes, the most brilliant economist probably ever lived, negotiated a loan. We thought that the Americans would be full of gratitude for our alliance with them. On the contrary, they gave pretty hard terms. They gave us the loan, which kept us going through the 40 or so years after the war. And you'll probably remember, being of a certain age, just what a sort of fairly scraped, pinched, grey, half-rebuilt country this was for many years, because we were spending so much of our time paying off and paying the interest on this enormous debt. And it put us, first of all, in hock to the United States. One of the reasons why they were able to pull the rug out from under us over Suez in 1956, when we started that mad war with the French against Egypt, was because we simply didn't have financial independence. The point I was making is that there are consequences to getting into debt.
Yes. No, I get that. But this
is different. I mean, the government is borrowing money to some extent which doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, where are we borrowing this money from?
Right, we're borrowing it from financial institutions, pension funds, insurance companies, people like that,
right,
who buy up things called government gilts. But increasingly, these are sold off at very, very low interest rates, which are then passed on, of course, to the people who've invested in pension funds, or passed on to people who take out insurance policies. You have to pay more for them, and it spreads into the system. And then there's been this quantitative easing, basically the creation of money, the printing of money without printing it,
which has been going on for a very long time.
Yeah,
I mean, the only difference I would have with your argument is that because now we haven't borrowed it from an entity as such or a foreign power as such, then if we, for example, defaulted on it in the same way that we defaulted against the Americans, what would the consequences be, if any? There might not be any.
My guess is, and I think we really are in the realms of guesswork, because no one's ever borrowed this much money in peacetime before, and probably not in wartime. The rate at which Rishi Sunak is handing out money in the furlough scheme is so colossal that no one's ever seen anything like it in their lives. And when he extended it to October last week, very large numbers of people in the city and in the Economist fraternity just gasped and stretched their eyes because they couldn't believe that he'd done this. Because it is so vast. I think the danger has to be that these pretty blue and brown beer tokens, which circulate as money in this country, exist entirely on the basis of confidence. The world has to have confidence in them, and we have to. And you risk losing that confidence. First of all, our international credit ratings have been sliding over the past 10 years or so. If they slide much more, it becomes much, much harder for us to do this. And also the value of the pound against both assets and other currencies begins to slide, which inevitably leads to quite serious inflation.
But the pound has been doing better since we left the European Union, has it not?
Well, I mean, the pound devalued on the day of the referendum result, not because of the panic, but because everybody knew it was overvalued.
Right.
It has been for some time. It's not necessarily a good thing to have an overvalued currency. It means that you actually strangle your economy in many ways and make exports difficult.
Yeah.
I don't want this to be an economics lesson, but I would say that the danger is, it seems to me, that first of all, the interest rates become so low that people will no longer save. So where are they?
Well, I think we were already at that point. I mean, most people now.
People have to save because if you want a pension, you've got to save.
Well, you put it in a pension fund, but you don't have a savings account.
It's the pension funds that are, and indeed the life insurance schemes, which are lending to the government, but the government can force them to lend to them at quite low interest rates.
Right. But I think your point is well made.
This is the way it works. And so in the end, it works into those people who have been prudent and have saved will suffer. And there are other things. The government will also have to go for tax rises. There was a fascinating piece in the Financial Times on Saturday, which is online to some people, but not.
Yes, unfortunately, it's behind a paywall. A lot of the FT stuff.
Most of it is. It's by somebody called Emma Aguirre. It's called "The Tax: How We Will Be Paying for the Pandemic Measures," and it goes through all the things right up to the most frightening of all, which is the capital levy, which may come, which is basically a raid on everybody's savings, including the value of your house.
Well, they won't get anything from me because I haven't got any savings.
Well, have you got a house?
No. Well, I live by the rental world of.
Well, then you're okay. But
yeah.
An awful lot of people
well, I've been very prudent about. I've been very prudent on that. Well, you see, I think it's absolutely disgusting and disgraceful that people who have saved for all their lives and get a house and hope to pass it on to their children, then have that house taken off them already by the people who say they must pay for their own social care.
Yeah, I mean that's an aspect of it.
Shocking.
I think it is shocking, but the thing is that everything is in the next year or so is going to be presented as an emergency. We're all going to be told this is coronavirus emergency. We have to do it. It's all part of the great national effort against the virus. And there will be no argument against it. Parliament will fold. Most of the media will fold. They'll say, well, we have to do it because we've got ourselves into such a deep pit that anybody who claims they're going to get us out of it is going to get some sort of national all-pulled-together support. And when it's all over and we're all broke and we've got used to much higher levels of income tax and VAT and national insurance and fuel duties and all the other ways in which the government sticks its hands in our pockets, which it does all the time, directly and indirectly, it'll be too late to do anything about it because it will happen. It'll be a fait accompli.
Well, you say that, but of course there is an alternative, and the alternative is that you're completely wrong, and that the government. That the government is now in a position which is so bad, rather like the way that some companies were never allowed to go bankrupt. I'm not talking about the banks. I'm talking about other companies, media companies, who were in hock to such an extent to the banks that the banks actually kept them going because they knew that if they let them die, they'd lose all their money. So they kept them going until they got their money back. Now, I believe that the government has been put in this ridiculously, and I agree with you that it's a ridiculous situation, that it's crazy that they're borrowing all this money, but because it's so unprecedented, it may well be that they decide the best way out of it is just to keep borrowing and never to try and put more taxes on the people.
I don't think they can do that. I mean, we can argue about it.
They could, though.
It's futile. If they do, I think the danger of a really serious inflationary spiral and a collapse of confidence in the currency does become much greater. I think they're going to have to put taxes up. The alternative would have to be, for instance, to make immediate serious cuts in the NHS to freeze the wages of the very public service.
Well, they could actually, hush my mouth for saying it, but they could actually find places to cut the NHS. I was shown a couple of adverts for job vacancies in the NHS the other day, and they have things like diversity coordinators for £65,000. You know, you could go through, I'm sure, like I could, with a hot knife through butter, the NHS budget and cut it to ribbons and make it an awful lot cheaper and make the money be spent better and more efficiently.
If it's so easy, you have to ask yourself why nobody's done it so far.
Well, it's not in anybody's interest to do it.
The power of the health service unions is as pressure groups and also as brilliant publicists is considerable, and government's very afraid to take them on. I'd say we can't predict. We can only speculate. My speculation is what I've said. Yours is different from mine.
Yes.
But I think I would advise people to beware of the idea.
Worryingly, I keep meeting people, Peter.
Huge payday loan, which Rishi Sunak has provided for the nation, will not have to be paid back. And nice, smiling Rishi Sunak won't be the person who comes after you for it. It will be those hard-faced guys.
It'll be the Grim Reaper.
HMRC.
Yeah. What I wanted to say to you was
very diligent, and they keep on coming.
What I wanted to say to you was that worryingly, I keep meeting people who say things to me like, "I think Peter Hitchens might be right."
Yeah. I'm sorry about that.
Troubles me.
I believe there is cognitive behaviour therapy for this available on the NHS.
Now, talking of the unions, are we about to see, do you think, a kind of a lining up of the battle lines with the teachers' unions, the transport unions, who are all amazingly frightened to go back to work, but only seemingly if they're in one of the big unions?
I think that the problem remains, and here we come back to the basis of this whole argument. The problem remains the government has frightened the population so much that it is very difficult for it now to argue that it's safe for people to go back to normal, either on the transport system or in schools. I personally think that the risk of doing so is very small, but it remains a minority opinion. Again, another of my, I was out bicycling in one of the more prosperous areas of Oxford this morning, where the roads are very wide and the pavements are very wide. Yeah. And as I whizzed on my bicycle down the road and listening to birdsong, my bicycle was audible to a woman, a mother, and her 3 children on the pavement. And she gathered her brood together and pulled them away from the edge of the road, lest, as I passed, I infected them with the deadly virus. Right. This is the extent of the fear.
Yes.
And that was in highly educated North Oxford. This isn't in some superstitious area. It was some highly educated person gathered her children away from the edge of the road, lest, as I went by, and I'm boasting here, but about 15 miles an hour, I infected them.
Tragically, of course, education is no substitute for common sense, and an awful lot of these overeducated buffoons are the very ones that are leading this madness.
This is the extent of the fear which the government has created. It's created so much fear, it now can't get it back under control. And all the teachers' unions need to say, well, if you want to open the schools, why did you close them in the first place? And it's a very good question. But the measures which are being proposed in any case, all this, wearing of muzzles and gloves and standing apart from immense distances and all that, they're as unsustainable as a New Year resolution. You could not keep this up. Society could not keep up the measures which are being proposed in the transport system and the school system for any length of time. People just won't be able to do it.
No.
The morning they'll run out of masks, they'll run out of gloves, they'll run out of sanitizer. Someone will make a mistake. There'll be too many people in the room. It's unsustainable. And the fact is, it doesn't matter that it's unsustainable because it's crazy.
Well, it's not crazy because here's the thing:
the danger of the disease is to people working in schools is very minor.
Yes, well, of course it is. And also, as we were talking to an author who's written a book about Checkpoint Charlie, in Germany right now, one of the regions of Germany has proved itself to be coronavirus free. It has now got no new cases. It has had no new cases for some considerable time. We're learning that in London there was only, I think, 24 cases the other day. It could well be that the virus is starting to diminish, in which case all of these social measures may not be necessary anymore anyway. So I think as time goes on, it will be a case of kind of physician heal thyself, won't it?
Well, I wish that was so, but the government's insistence is until the vaccine is developed, then fundamentally this sort of thing is going to have to continue indefinitely.
I don't think so. I really don't.
I hope you're right.
Well, I mean, did you see in Germany?
Again,
in Germany, they had people drinking in bars, watching football. Heaven forfend, it was actually going on. They were standing quite a long way from each other.
Well, that's the thing. You see, pubs, if they're allowed to reopen, they won't be able to function if they have to keep half or 2/3 of their tables and chairs empty, or if they can only function in good weather when people can drink outside. That's not a basis for business. It won't work. They've lost enough as it is. If they have to come back with profits restricted to almost nothing, probably income restricted, they won't make any profits on that if they hire any staff. and for socially distanced pubs, staff are necessary to bring stuff to the table. How are they going to afford this? It won't work.
And therefore it'll have to change.
Nice pictures of people in the Gendarmenmarkt in Berlin having a drink, but it's not actually reached a practical level. And until we accept that this thing was a mad, overreacting panic, which it was, we're stuck with this. And the government has to admit it, but in admitting it, it has to admit it was wrong. And this is terribly difficult to get governments to admit that they're wrong.
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely right. But the thing is, though, that every single week that you and I have spoken, something else has changed. And so, the narrative has changed, or, one of the goalposts has moved. Nothing is as it was, at the beginning of this. This is the 7th week we've spoken. Yeah. And since week 1, every single week, something else has changed. And so the story moves. And so,
I don't think so much. I think that the superficiality of it all, fundamentally, a grave and damaging mistake has been made, which has transformed society for the worse, and there's no obvious way out. And at the same time, as I say, we're clocking up on the meter this most enormous bill, which is going to have to be paid. When is the emergency budget?
Well, maybe not.
When is
you've told me
budget going to be. There will be an emergency budget. I promise you that.
But your history lesson from earlier on says that we can sometimes say, no, we're actually not going to pay you back. We're going to default on the loan.
Yeah, but the thing about being a debtor is that you put yourself in the power of the people to whom you're in debt.
Maybe,
that's what you do, and then you lose, and you lose forever freedoms which you used to have, or you lose forever, in our case, a standard of living which you used to have as well. You can't get it back.
Well, that's not true, because if, as you say, it was a bit dull and kind of grim in the 60s and in most of the 70s.
40s, 50s, 60s.
Well, I didn't live in the 40s or the 50s.
No, I didn't, but I know people who did.
Yeah.
There were times.
There was a world war on, which didn't help.
Hang on a minute, we won the war, didn't we? We're living as a defeated
but the
nation.
50s was one of the most expansive and spendthrift decades of all. Well, you've never had it so good, was what Harold Macmillan said, wasn't it?
It was pretty. I think the never had it so good was probably the early 60s, but the 50s were, and I do remember them, were pretty bleak.
Oh, they were. No, listen, I know that we.
I remember as a period basically of chilblains and lard. Yeah. And I don't. It wasn't. People often accuse me of hankering for the 1950s. That's the reverse of the case.
No, quite.
It was horrible, grubby, and everything was broken.
Yes, but I grew up in the 80s as well.
Still really chewed up by the war.
Yeah, but I grew into adulthood in the 80s basically, and there was never a better decade for opportunity, for equality, for absolute and utter fundamentalist market economics, which raised Britain out of all of that nonsense and the strikes and the general problems and the 3-day week. And suddenly the 80s, with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, two of the closest leaders on either side of the Atlantic, with a great relationship, who basically forced the Russians into capitulating and giving up the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I used to think that, but it doesn't, again...
Well, that's what happened.
It doesn't stand out so much examination, and particularly if you worked in any of the industrial parts of the country, it was a very bleak period, again, with people simply losing jobs, which has sustained family life and civilization, in huge numbers, whole communities...
Yeah, well, they shut the pits.
...into pieces, and not forgotten, I have to say. And also foolish things, in my view, like the destruction of the council estates, which were a great loss, and the destruction of council housing, one of the biggest political mistakes in this country in the past 50 years. Look at the housing benefit, which is the nearest we get to a substitute for it, costs as much as the Royal Air Force. And doesn't actually provide anything like as much of a good
subsidises landlords
people who can't afford to buy houses.
Yeah, I know. I agree with that.
Who need houses with gardens to live in. So Thatcher, and as for the destruction of the Soviet Union, well, maybe, but I mean that's something I do know a bit about, and I think that their role in it may have been rather bigger than they.
All I'm saying, though, Peter, is that the bleakness of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s did come to an end. So it's not right to say that it wouldn't ever change.
No, but if you travelled in that period in what was then West Germany, or indeed France, what you found was that these countries which had done much worse in the war than we had actually achieved a much higher standard of living than we had.
Well, they've always been
enviably so. I mean, the French used to refer to the 30 glorious years. During that time, we, paying off our debt and reduced this greyness, were far behind them in standard of living, and it was very evident to anybody who travelled that we suffered for many decades. And the really bad thing
but certainly in France,
the people who suffered, Mike, were the people who'd done the fighting and the enduring.
But also in France, I mean, there were massive pockets of what you can only be described as rural poor, which we didn't really have in this country. And I remember it because we used to drive as a family in our Austin-Cambridge A60 across the continent of Europe. My mother was the only driver because my father failed his test and never took it again. And we used to drive to Venice, a place called Lido di Jesolo, where we camped every summer. So we went through Germany and Austria, and I slept through quite a lot of it. But I always remember in France.
Did you take your own food?
No, I think we always stayed in people's houses. Strangely enough, my dad had
a lot of people took their own food in those days because you could only take a very small amount of money abroad.
Yes. It was
perverse. The currency restrictions. It was written in your. You went to the bank. You got the money. It was written in your passport.
Yes, that's right.
You couldn't take any more.
I remember that.
And we were all complete. Therefore, British and British people didn't go to America in those days unless they got a special permission from the Treasury.
No, I know. We'll have to wrap it up very shortly.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is fascinating.
It was an era of considerable privation, and it was caused by getting into debt.
And we also had to keep changing money as we crossed each border, and we'd then stagger into sort of post offices and try and find somebody that spoke the local language, and so we need to change. And my father would empty his pockets with all these coins to try and change from francs into lira to Deutschmarks into whatever else. But anyway, Pfennigs, it was great. We'll talk some more fascinating stuff. Peter Hitchens, week 8 is next Monday. Don't miss it. This is Talk Radio.
Talk Radio.